Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at the first round of the World Chess Championship being held in Sochi, Russia, between the current world champion Magnus Carlsen and the previous world champion Viswanathan Anand. Currently, at the time of posting this video, Carlsen is the world champion as a result of having won the previous match in 2013 against Viswanathan Anand. In this game, the first game, Viswanathan Anand handled the white pieces and opened up with the move pawn to d4. And with this move, white signals his intention to fight for the center, usually by means of playing the moves pawn to d4, pawn to c4, knight to c3, and then pawn to e4. This is the typical plan, which is associated with the queen's pawn opening. Black, Magnus Carlsen, replied with the common move knight to f6, preventing the move pawn to e4, and at the same time developing a piece. White continued with pawn to c4. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen is well known to be playing two moves in this position. There are two moves which Carlsen generally chooses from. One move would be the move pawn to e6, and this is the most straightforward approach for black to prevent white from being able to achieve the move e2 to e4. And the reason for this is that if white plays the move knight to c3, black has access to the pin, bishop to b4, preventing the move pawn to e4, as e4 can be met with knight takes e4, and the knight is pinned on c3. This is one of the most popular ways for white to continue against the queen's pawn opening, but instead, Magnus Carlsen continued with the move pawn to g6, an alternative approach to developing the dark squared bishop. With the move pawn to g6, black intends to place the bishop on the g7 square, fianchettoing the bishop and placing the bishop on the long diagonal. From g7, the bishop has great potential to attack the d4 point and put pressure on white's center, while white continues to play pawn moves in order to try to gain the center. So black played the move pawn to g6 here, preparing to bring the bishop to g7. Now from here, white has a few different options available, but the most direct is to play the move knight to c3, preparing the move pawn to e4, and this is the move Anand chose in the game. Now from here, there are two options available for black. If black continues with the move bishop to g7, we have the King's Indian opening, after which it is most common for white to continue with the move pawn to e4, gaining the center. d6 is generally played, knight to f3, and from here, white has a sizable space advantage, but black hopes to argue eventually that he can put counter pressure on the center and then make use of the imbalances in the position, such as the position of the dark squared bishop, or in certain cases, the possibility of a kingside attack. However, in this game, Carlsen did not choose to play the King's Indian. Instead, he played the Grunfeld, an opening which Carlsen has more often played in this position, with the move pawn to d5. And this is one of the most flagrant approaches known as a hypermodern opening. The idea here is that black is willing to give white a terrifying center after the moves pawn takes pawn on d5, knight takes pawn on d5, and then the most common reply, pawn to e4, knight takes c3, and pawn takes pawn on c3, when white has an incredible center here, pawn on e4, pawn on d4, pawn on c3 supporting the pawns, and this should act as a prophylactic measure preventing black from being able to deploy his queenside pieces as adequately as he'd like. For example, the light squared bishop in this position is lacking the f5 square as a result of the e-pawn, and is also lacking the e6 square as a result of the potential of the move pawn to d5, and the move bishop to g4 is also not feasible at the moment. Additionally, the knight on b8 lacks its most sensible square on c6 because of the potential of the move pawn to d5. Also, in certain cases, black should have difficulty playing the move pawn to c5, but in the Grunfeld, black most often is able to achieve this move pawn to c5. But as a theoretical principle, one of the value of having the center is that black should also find himself restrained in the ability to bring his pawns up to the 5th rank, and this is the idea of this center. While black hurries to continue his development and play for counterplay in the center, white hopes to defend the center, set up a formidable position, and then look for attacking chances as a result of his space advantage. So to show an example of a couple of the main lines here, it's black to move here after the move bishop b takes c3. So bishop to g7 is most often played. And now one of the main lines is bishop to c4, pawn to c5, knight to e2, defending the d4 pawn in such a way as to be able to handle the move bishop to g4 with pawn to f3. This is why e2 is chosen. Castles kingside, and from here we reach a position where white has defended the d4 pawn adequately, has brought his pieces out, but black can look for counterplay by eventually capturing on d4, bringing the knight out, exploiting the pin of the bishop against the d4 line, and looking for counterplay by attacking the center. And this is one of the main lines, with white having a reasonable advantage here. Another line, which has often been played in this position, instead of the move bishop to c4, is the immediate move knight to f3, pawn to c5, and now rook to b1, which not only sidesteps the important diagonal that black was putting pressure on, but also by putting pressure on the b7 pawn, acts as a prophylactic measure, making it once again difficult for black to deploy the light-squared bishop. After the move rook to b1, there generally follows castles kingside, bishop to e2, and now there are a couple fashionable moves here. One idea is simply for black to play pawn to b6, followed by bishop to b7, attacking the central pawn on e4. Or another option would be pawn takes pawn on d4, pawn takes pawn on d4, queen to a5 check, and now white has an option between gambiting a pawn with bishop to d2, queen takes a2, when white will argue that the pressure on the b7 pawn, the center, and chances of attacking the king fully compensate for the loss of the pawn on a2, or white can also play queen to d2, going in for a variety of endgames, where black may attempt to argue that his 2 versus 1 queenside pawn majority is worth slightly more than white's attacking chances conferred by the central pawns. The general assessment of this position after queen to a5 check is that black is very close to equality as a result of the forcing lines which appear after either bishop d2, queen takes a2, or queen to d2. So these are the main lines which are possible in the Grunfeld opening. Now back to the game, Viswanathan Anand and Magnus Carlsen. This position was reached right before white generally plays the move pawn to e4. But in this game, Anand went for a sideline. Instead of playing the move pawn to e4, Viswanathan Anand played the move bishop to d2, first defending the knight on c3, and then playing for the move pawn to e4. The idea of this move is that after the moves bishop to g7 as played in the game, and pawn to e4, after knight takes c3, Viswanathan Anand had the option not to recapture with the b pawn, but instead to capture with the bishop. Bishop takes c3, and this is exactly the position that arose in the game. White has still managed to give himself a compact center here with pawns on e4 and pawns on d4, and so still benefits from some of the prophylactic measures against the queenside pieces, but white has managed to do this in a way which avoids placing a pawn on the c3 square and also avoids some of the sorties that we saw, such as queen to a5 check, for example. This line has been somewhat popular at the Grandmaster level, being played about 3 or 4 times less than the direct move pawn to e4 and recapturing of the pawn on c3. And in my opinion, this does not seem like a very enterprising method for white. Perhaps Anand, was looking for a way to take Carlsen out of theory and to test black's preparation in this line. And Carlsen did deliver with an important idea on move 9 here. So bishop takes c3 was played. Black simply castled kingside. Now, amongst the various moves possible, Anand continued with the move queen to d2. Now, what's the idea of this move? Well, there are a couple advantages to this move, queen to d2. In the first place, white makes it possible for himself to castle on the queen side, and by doing so, he opens up the possibility of a direct kingside assault with the moves h4 to h5, opening up the h-file and then seeking an attack on the king side. And this is made possible after queen d2 by the fact that white will be able to castle queenside. Another advantage of the move queen to d2 is that if at any time black deploys a piece to c6 or even plays the move pawn to c5 here, and white replies with the move pawn to d5, now if at any time an exchange of bishops happens on the c3 square, white will be able to recapture with the queen, and by doing so he will once again manage to keep his pawn structure a little bit more compact, and this should make it easier for him to defend his pawns over the long term and seek counterplay on the king side, because once again white can castle queenside here. So these are some of the potential ideas latent with the move queen to d2. Now, many commentators had said that the most popular move here in the database is pawn to c5, and this position has not been reached many times, so it's not completely accurate in my mind to speak of a most popular move here. Carlsen quickly played the move knight to c6, and this must have come as a little bit of a surprise to Anand as he took some time here. With the move knight to c6, black is putting immediate pressure on the d4 pawn and is aiming perhaps to play the move pawn to e5, quickly attacking the d4 point and forcing white to play d5 when the knight can snuggle into the d4 square and cause immediate problems for Anand. The downside of the move knight to c6 is that black has not first prepared the move with pawn to c5, and so in certain cases, black may find it difficult to continue his attack against the d4 pawn if white is able to secure the pawn adequately. But as we see in the game, black has sufficient resources to continue the attack. After white played the move knight to f3, Carlsen simply continued bishop to g4, again renewing some of the pressure on the d4 pawn and attacking the knight on f3. In order to address these threats, white played the most natural move, pawn to d5. Bishop takes f3 was played, preparing the e5 square so that the knight can land there by first removing the knight on f3. And now white has two options available. In the game, the move bishop takes g7 was played, followed by king takes g7, g takes f3, and now knight to e5, the knight gaining that crucial e5 square. Another way to play, instead of playing the move bishop takes g7, white could also have played the move g takes f3, and then the knight would again come to the square, e5. And now to protect against the move knight takes f3 check, white would most likely play the move bishop to e2, and now black would have an option between breaking in the center with the move pawn to c6, attacking the d5 pawn, or also the move pawn to e6. And this variation illustrates that black's main idea is still to crack against the center before white has time to complete his development. So moving back to the way that the game actually panned out, the move bishop takes f3 was played. White played bishop takes g7, king takes g7, recapturing the bishop as it was in fact attacking a rook on f8. G takes f3 was played, and now knight to e5. From here, the crucial imbalances of the position have mostly been set up. White continues to have a space advantage with the advanced pawn on d5, but in this position, it doesn't count for very much as black has managed to already exchange off 3 pairs of minor pieces and has achieved a useful square for his knight on e5. Therefore, the game will come down to whether or not white is able to usurp the knight on e5, forcing it to move to an inferior square, and whether white can prove that his light-squared bishop is stronger than the knight, and also the game depends on white's options of creating a kingside attack. White still has the option available in the long term of bringing the h-pawn down the board, thereby opening up the h-file and coordinating the rook and queen for an attack against the king. So this is the position which was reached. Now, Anand very quickly, as if to have prepared this position, Anand very quickly played the move castles queenside. Very interesting and enterprising choice in this position. The king is not entirely safe on the queen side here, and this became the basis for much of Carlsen's play throughout the game. After castles queenside, white has indirectly handled the threat of knight takes f3, since now the move knight takes f3 does not come with check. The king is no longer on the e1 square, and so white can quickly recover the knight with the move queen to c3 check, thereby picking up the knight for a single pawn and winning the game at once. Therefore, the move castling queenside serves as an appropriate defense of the f3 pawn, and at the same time, white is now definitely signaling his intentions to bring the h-pawn up the board to the h5 square and to begin a kingside assault. In order to address these factors, black as quickly as possible needs to open up attacking chances on the queen side. And this is a common principle in the opening and middle game phases, as is quite commonly known that once the kings have castled on opposite sides of the board, it is most direct and most accurate for both sides typically to attack the king. And therefore, black quickly played the move pawn to c6, attacking the center and also threatening to open up the c-file for a direct attack against the king. From here, Anand had several different moves available, and I would say that at this point the game is already very clearly equalized with roughly equal play for both sides, and therefore the opening has turned out as a success for black. White continued with the move queen to c3, pinning the knight on e5. Pawn to f6 was played, and now the move bishop to h3, attacking the c8 square, so that after c takes d5, which was played in the game, black will not have access to the pin with rook to c8. Now came a very interesting choice by Anand. Instead of playing the move rook takes d5, which could very well be a mistake in this position, as after queen to b6, black immediately threatens to play the move pawn to e6, which not only threatens the rook on d5, but also cuts the bishop on h3, thereby allowing the move rook to c8. So after queen to b6, white would be threatened with immediate disaster. So instead of this mistake, rook takes d5, white continued with e takes d5, leading to a very interesting structure here, where white still has chances of attacking the king side, perhaps playing f4 to f5 at the correct moment, but the pawns are also shattered and offer black long-term chances, which black actually came very close to exploiting in the game. Now, let's go back to the beginning and make a recap of what's taken place so far. Anand opened up with the move pawn to d4, and Carlsen selected the Grunfeld opening after knight f6, c4, g6, knight to c3, and the Grunfeld pawn to d5. Anand initiated the popular exchange variation with c takes d5 and knight takes d5, but rather than playing the most common and most principled reply with the move pawn to e4, Anand instead chose a bit of a sideline with the move bishop to d2, and only after the move bishop to g7 did white follow up with pawn to e4, knight takes c3, and bishop takes c3. Play continued with castles kingside and queen d2, and fairly quickly after the move knight to c6, it appears that black has achieved rough equality in this position, or at least that Anand was not able to show anything here. The pressure on the d4 pawn, which was stepped up after knight f3 and bishop to g4, forced white to modify the center by playing the move pawn to d5, thereby allowing black to cement his knight on the e5 square, which he did by first eliminating the defender. Bishop takes f3. An exchange of bishops on g7 took place, and the knight now reached the c3 square. Anand ambitiously chose to castle queenside, and now after the move pawn to c6, queen c3, and pawn to f6, bishop h3, c takes d5, e takes d5, we've reached the key position where the sides have castled on opposite sides, white's pawn structure is shattered, and yet there are attacking chances on black's king. Also, the bishop on h3 is very nicely stationed so as to prevent a rook from appearing on the c8 square. That's all for this first video. In the next video, by clicking here, you'll be able to take a look at what took place from this position. We hope to see you again, and thanks for watching.